Great to have you with us for the Digging Deep Men's Bible Study podcast. We're into month 7 in our 2020-2021 study of the Ten Commandments, and today we're going to be studying the command, honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with promise, as Paul says in Ephesians 6. So we'll be ready for Exodus chapter 20 and verse 12, and we're glad to have Ben Gisselbaugh with us to study today. Hi, Ben.
Hey, it's great to be here.
We want to remind everyone that our podcasts are available to listen on Google Podcasts and Apple Podcasts and also the Spotify channels. And those are actually video podcasts there. And then also the videos are now posted on our YouTube channel. We have a YouTube channel which you can find very easily by going to YouTube and searching Digging Deep Men's Bible Study. And all of our backlog of podcasts from our first 3 years of doing the Digging Deep study are available there. I should say all the ones that we have. Unfortunately, in the early days, we had some technical complications that have made it so that there are some unavailable. But for the most part, they are there from especially this year and last year. So if you missed any of those podcasts, or if you would like to have an easy place where you can go and share them with your friends, then YouTube is often an easy way to do that. It's easy to take a link from YouTube and post it on Facebook if you want to share it. And even though we have a Facebook group that requires people to join, and the discussion on Facebook is only available to those in the group, and there are various reasons for that. Even though that's sort of private, at the same time, we want the study material to be available to everyone free of charge, just whenever they can access it. So feel free to go on the YouTube channel and don't treat that like a closed group or something that should be private. That's something that could be shared with anybody, right, Ben?
Absolutely.
Okay, so if there are no more preliminaries, and I guess there are not, I can't think of anything else we need to say, let's get into our study and talk first about, I suppose, the difference between obeying our parents and honoring our parents. This command says, honor your father and mother. Paul says when he brings up the passage in Ephesians 6 that that children should obey their parents, and then he says, honor your father and mother. So as you were saying, Ben, before we came into the podcast, honoring parents when we're a child shows itself in obedience. But as we grow out of obeying, and we honor them in different ways and in a fuller sense. A 3-year-old can't honor his parents in the same way that a 30-year-old can honor his parents. So we grow into stronger ways of doing that. But I guess I would also suggest that children who grow up obeying their parents are much more likely to honor their parents when they get older.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And you also think about the command for children to obey their parents, to honor their parents. Of course, at a young age, a child can't, that's a command that is not intended for children to be the first ones that read that. That's a command to parents.
Both in ancient Israel and in Ephesus.
Absolutely. A parent is commanded to teach their children how to obey, how to honor. And so this is a command that's just as much for parents as it is for children, especially for young children.
I thought it might be good to look at the Hebrew word translated honor in the command. And this is a word that literally means heaviness, or to ascribe weight to something. And so if we honor our parents, then we're treating them as carrying significance, aren't we? And that word is used, if you look up the usage of that word throughout the Old Testament, it's used of God and people who are deserving of honor. And, of course, God is deserving of more honor than any other being. But it's used in a variety of contexts where people should be shown honor. We should ascribe weight to them. And it's the mark of a mature person and a God-fearing person that he knows how to ascribe the proper honor both to God and to the requisite people.
Absolutely. The kind of two qualities that are seen in that Hebrew word that's translated honor is a heaviness which will have a dulling effect, and then heaviness which has a weight. It's heavy because of the weight that's attached to it. And so In Genesis chapter 48, verse 10, we read about his eyes being heavy. That means dull with age. And but the word that's used is the word heavy. His eyes became heavy. He wasn't able to see because his eyes were heavy. Or of course in 1 Samuel chapter 5, the Philistines they wanted the ark removed from their presence, from their city, because they were God's hand was heavy there.
Right.
They felt the effect of God's presence, God's punitive presence,
Certainly.
because they had the ark there.
That's right. And this would be the opposite. This idea would be the opposite of treating God lightly when we, for example, thought about taking his name in vain or treating the concept of God as if it were insignificant. This is treating God as holy and honoring him, ascribing weight to him. But this word here is used not about God specifically, but about parents. And the fact that this word can be used both ways calls to mind something that's hit me as a parent, which is that if my child doesn't learn to respect me, it's going to be very difficult for her or for him to learn to honor God as an adult.
Absolutely.
The first time they
Absolutely.
learn to ascribe honor is to mom and dad, and especially to dad, if things are operating the way they should.
And kids that have poor parents, poor examples of discipline, of love, of patience, of tenderness, they're gonna be disadvantaged as adults, understanding God as a father, because they have no good examples of parenting growing up.
Right. Then when we turn over to Ephesians 6:2, the word translated honor is very similar to the word in Exodus 20, but the literal meaning is a little different, having to do with estimating something as having high value. It's less like treating it as being weighty and more like putting a high price tag on something. But the upshot of all that is the same, that we treat our parents as being very important. And we might instantly think about, when I show honor or respect for my parents, is that contingent on whether my parents are respectable or honorable in their behavior? And the command in Ephesians 6 is given to Christians, who some of whom would be adults whose parents are not Christians. And so that would indicate you need to show honor insofar as you can, even to non-Christian parents. And that would show itself differently than the case where a child has Christian parents and is showing respect for consistent, respectable behavior. But even those with non-Christian parents can still obey this command to honor their parents.
The common denominator is respect. I mean, even if you have non-Christian parents and you're unable to go along with something, maybe they have a preference that would be sinful for you to follow through with, or they have belief systems that would be sinful for you to validate or support. You're not rude, you're not resentful or rebellious in how you respond to that. Much like the Christian in government, sometimes there are ethical problems that the Christian faces as it relates to laws of the land. And of course, Acts chapter 5, verse 29 says that we've got to obey God rather than man. But we don't have a disrespectful spirit when we cannot comply with ungodly commands. And the same is true with our parents. If a non-Christian parent has something, an illicit desire for something, or an illicit wish, you're not going to comply with that, but you're going to be respectful in the process.
And 1 Timothy 2:17 says that we honor the king. And that word honor is the same word that's used in Ephesians 6 for honoring parents. And that will show itself, again, in the actual behavior that is expressive of that honor. There will be some differences. You don't show honor to the king in the same way you show honor to your dad, but the same concept is there. And I think you're right to say the common denominator is respect.
I like the imagery in the Old Testament word for honor of feeling the weight of something. It's the opposite of something being light. And so many times you have kids today, children and adults, who have a light view of their responsibility toward their parents. And I like the imagery of feeling the weight. You feel the seriousness of something. I'll pick up the baby bag that my wife will carry around sometimes because I want to help her. A good man wants to carry the weight of the baby bag, but sometimes you'll pick up this baby bag and it's pretty heavy because there's a lot of things in that bag, and you're kind of shocked by how heavy these bags are sometimes.
Right, it's a workout.
And, sometimes high schoolers will, public school, private school, will be given a fake baby to carry around. And that baby sometimes is electronic, and it will go off and it will require feeding or maintenance of some kind. And the design of that is to not only teach parenting skills that will be helpful, but also to remind these children of the weight of what a child will do to their lifestyle. It will drastically change the lifestyle that they had before.
Right. When I think about carrying that baby bag, that also calls to mind the weight of everything that the wife is doing to rear the children. When you carry around that bag and you think, this is not an easy job she has, what's happening there? You are estimating it at a higher cost. You're recognizing the sacrifice that she's making, and we should do that with our parents. 1 Timothy 5, verse 4 says that we owe a debt to our parents to make some repayment. And I know not everything we do for our parents is precisely cashed out in terms of a debt repayment. There's a philosopher named Simon Keller who has analyzed different theories of the relationship between grown children and their parents. And sometimes the debt theory, that we do what we do for our grown parents because we owe a debt to them, sometimes it doesn't really work as an analogy because, for example, our parents may not want to be repaid anything per se, and then also it may be difficult to quantify what our parents did for us and what we've done for them in such a way that you could ever say the debt is now repaid. So it doesn't exactly work as some kind of a computation, but nonetheless, we cannot avoid thinking, wow, mom and dad have done so much for me when I could do nothing for myself. And so how could we avoid thinking that we owe them something after all they did for us?
Mm-hmm.
And by the way, Keller thinks, and this would be biblical, even though he's not advocating for what the Bible teaches, but he advocates for the special goods theory of the responsibility of grown children to their parents, which is that grown parents and their children, grown children and their parents, share some special goods, and the child can offer to his parents some goods that nobody else can. For example, there's some goods that anybody could give to our parents, like if they need transportation. I, as their child, am not the only one in the world who could give them transportation. I could even hire somebody else to do that, or they could hire somebody, or house cleaning, or preparation of meals. Anybody could theoretically do that. But there are certain goods that only I can give to my parents because I'm their son. And we share so much history and understanding and knowledge and humor and tradition and whatever the case may be. Those things, not just anybody could do with my parents. In fact, whom do my parents want to be present at Thanksgiving and Christmas and special occasions? It's not just anybody, it's the family, because we share a bond and these special goods, according to Keller. And so Keller's argument is, if I alone, or I among a select few people, can give these special goods to my parents, and they can get them in no other way. They can't go online and buy these special goods. They can't order them from anywhere. They can't hire somebody else to give those goods to them. If I'm the only one, or I and my sister, or I and my cousins, if we're the only ones who can give it to our parents, then we ought to do that. And wouldn't that
Yeah.
just be following the golden rule? Because I want those goods. I want to share memories and stories and laughter and sentimental gifts and so forth with my family. And I also would like for someone who has shared commitment over time with me to help me when I'm in need. Not just anybody, but the person who understands my plight best because we have a shared background. Those are the types of things that are priceless. And I
Absolutely.
should give those to my parents if at all possible. And especially we were talking about in their old age when they become less able to care for themselves. And that's where I think 1 Timothy 5 is so helpful, because when we say honor our parents, well, all of us would like to say, sure, I'll honor my parents. But when the rubber meets the road and we have to give them some support, even to the degree of special goods, then we ought to provide that. And 1 Timothy 5 says you have a responsibility to care for your family before the church does. The church shouldn't be burdened if the people in that immediate family can care for their aging parents. Anyway, I'm talking too much, but go ahead.
No, you're not. You consider the fact that you are as a child, are in a very unique position where you can validate your parents in a way that no one else can. You think about
Right.
how your parents sacrificed for you, and they're every good parent, I believe, walks around with the memory of failed opportunities to be there to provide for children, and the knowledge of all the specific ways that you sacrificed, that you tried to sculpt your children into who they need to be. And only you as a child then can in turn validate your parents by expressing appreciation in
That's
hindsight
right.
now.
That's a good
for
point.
what they've done, what they've sacrificed, and how you appreciate them, and how if it's true, then how you don't want any, you wouldn't go back and have any other parents but them. Again, only if that's true. But your words and your response also carry a weight that you need to recognize that they only you can give them.
Well, that's all very good. I think it'd be good for us now to turn to the Old Testament passages that follow up on or comment on the significance of this commandment to honor father and mother. And I've made a list, and I'm sure there are other passages that could be added, especially if we started to bring in a lot of examples of children who either honored or dishonored their parents. But, for example, Exodus 21:17, he who curses his father or mother shall surely be put to death. So there's the negative expression of the commandment that's in chapter 20. Still at Mount Sinai, God says, here, you should honor, but if you don't honor, if you actively dishonor, I guess I should say, cursing your father and mother, then that's a capital offense under the law of Moses. And then Leviticus 19:3, every one of you shall reverence his mother and his father. Leviticus 19:32, thou shalt rise up before the hoary head and honor the face of the old man and fear thy God. I am the Lord. Many passages in the Old Testament, of course, discuss honoring those who are older and presumably wiser. But that, of course, would include parents who are aged. Deuteronomy 5:16, honor your father and mother. There's the command stated in the Decalogue there and the restatement of them. Notice how Deuteronomy 5 says it, that your days may be prolonged and that it may go well with you. We'll talk about the promise attached to the command later on, but there's a little different expression in the Deuteronomy account. And then Deuteronomy 21:18, I thought it might be good for us to pause on this passage for a moment because it talks about the execution, how the execution is to be carried out of a stubborn and rebellious son who will not obey his father and mother. And we read there in verse 18, if any man has a stubborn and rebellious son who will not obey his father and mother, or his mother, and when they chastise him, he will not even listen to them, then his father and mother shall seize him and bring him out to the elders of his city at the gateway of his hometown. They shall say to the elders of his city, This son of ours is stubborn and rebellious. He will not obey us. He is a glutton and a drunkard. Then all the men of his city shall stone him to death. So you shall remove the evil from your midst, and all Israel will hear of it and fear. This is a way of keeping the Israelite nation pure. This is not something where we would imagine a little child being carried out in stone, because you see the kind of actions that this person is involved in. And in this case, it's not just dishonoring parents, but it's dishonoring them because they're trying to get the person to do rightly, and he's going into profligate sin. And so rather than allow his influence to spread like a gangrene through the nation, God says this person needs to be put to death. And part of his guilt is that he dishonored his parents. He's a glutton and a drunkard. So we're not talking about a 5-year-old, but somebody who could commit this kind of serious offense against God.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And then same book, chapter 27, verse 16, Deuteronomy, cursed is he who dishonors his father and or mother, and all the people shall say amen. Proverbs 16:31, the hoary head is a crown of glory if it be found in the way of righteousness. Proverbs 30:17, the eye that mocks a father and scorns a mother, the ravens of the valley will pick it out, and the young eagles will eat it. That's a visceral illustration of what happens to a person who disregards his parents' counsel. Everybody's a loser when you disobey godly parents who are trying to get you to do the right thing. If we think about a little kid, if he dishonors his parents, he's probably a goner, because he's going to play in traffic, or he's going to jump off a high place, or something's liable to happen to him disastrously, physically, because he's not obeying. But then when we talk about
natural selection.
Yes, natural selection. That's right, at its finest, I guess. But then when we think about somebody who grows up and dishonors his parents, well, that could be great spiritual trouble. Even if he knows not to touch a hot stove, still he may be in danger of a lot of things that he should have taken warning about when he was maybe 12, 13, 14 years old.
Absolutely.
Okay, so let's focus in a little bit on this idea of young people dishonoring an older person, maybe parents included, maybe not, but dishonoring those who are elderly and suffering God's punishment. And I guess the most vivid example is 2 Kings 2, where we have the bears coming out of the forest and eating the young men at Bethel. What do you think?
Well, now I just wanted to back up real quick. You don't want me to share some of my
passages? sorry. Go ahead. No, I'm sorry. I forgot.
There was just a few. You got most of them, but I just wanted to mention just Proverbs chapter 20, verse 20.
Good.
If one curses his father or his mother, his lamp will be put out in utter darkness. Proverbs 23:22, listen to your father who gave you life, and do not despise your mother when she is old. I think that's very good. Proverbs 31. This is obvious.
Right.
Verse 28, her children rise up and call her blessed. And I really tried to think of some examples, some Old Testament examples of disrespect. And of course, I think the most egregious example that I could think of was Absalom.
Right.
David's son, 2 Samuel chapter 15, how he disrespected his father by defying him and tried to usurp his role as king. And then you know what he did with his wives on the rooftop. Of course, Absalom needed to be put to death for all of that. You have Genesis 19.
But wasn't.
Right. But wasn't, yes. So you look at some of the weaknesses of David, and when you look at his weaknesses, you're kind of overwhelmed by all of his failures, his moral failures as a king, as a father, as a follower of God. I think there's lots of disrespect in Genesis 19, where you have the sons-in-laws of Lot, and they don't take his warning seriously. They just they take it his warnings didn't carry any weight, to use the word for honor. they were very light, and they just kind of, shrugged them off. And of course, there must have been much disrespect for the sons among the sons of Eli in 1 Samuel chapter 2, where they're described as worthless sons, and they were ungodly. They were just terrible, and how they must have shrugged off the parenting of Eli throughout their years. And Eli must have been, of course, a weak father who didn't demand honor from his children in their formative years. And you see what happened as they aged.
Right. Well, most of the good kings in Judah had sons who were bad kings. And we might think of Jehoshaphat, the son of Asa, as being an exception. And while we wouldn't say that the good kings who were the fathers were necessarily always good, Asa would be an example of one who had struggles that may have resulted in Jehoshaphat. Well, that's not the example I mean. For example, Hezekiah would be a good one on this point, where Hezekiah was faithful, but then maybe in the last 15 years of his life, after God had given him long life, and he became prideful, according to the Chronicles account, and showed his treasure to the Babylonians. And then his son, Manasseh, is one of the worst kings, maybe the worst, who brought on the actual captivity, who was the direct cause of the captivity because of his wickedness. So here's somebody who dishonored everything that Hezekiah stood for. And then we might even think of, in later days, Josiah, who was such a wonderful king, but then his son Jehoahaz did wickedness before God. So they're good kings who nevertheless had bad sons who dishonored their parents. Well, and even Solomon, who in his later days turned away from the Lord and maybe repented. We would hope Ecclesiastes represents his final repentance. But at any rate, there were so many things that he did that were wicked, that went beyond what David would have done in terms of idolatry. Not in terms necessarily of marrying multiple women, although he married a lot more than David did, but his idolatry was something David never got into. Yeah. And so there is dishonoring of parents in those cases. And, well, we could look at New Testament cases too. But
I didn't mean to get us too far off track.
No, that's good.
Go back to where you wanted to go, but I just wanted to. I worked hard on those examples.
No, that's good.
I put thought into them.
Let's think about, since we're bringing up the father and child, or parent and child connection, what are things that we can do to make sure that our children do grow up in honoring their parents? Because after all, as you said before, Ephesians 6 is written to adults. It's written to the saints at Ephesus and not to the children at Ephesus. So while we do want them to read it, if we're the Christians at Ephesus, we want the kids to read it, but we know that we bear the responsibility to teach our children how to obey and how to honor. So what steps would you recommend biblically for people to help their children learn to honor their parents?
My son is 6 years old, and I am every day reminded of how I need to do better. I could give better examples had you asked me this question 6 years ago before I had any children than I am now. So I'm just kind of amazed at how I don't have all the answers. But I think one of the things is consistency in demanding respect. I think that, of course, every parent has it within their DNA, an understanding that their child needs to respect them. But I think that it's a real challenge to be consistent in that. And I think that parents need to make sure that any act of defiance or any instance of disrespect, I think, however small, I think that a good parent is going to notice that and respond to that appropriately, demanding respect. Even the smallest infraction should be responded to.
It's a lot easier to let something go in the moment because you can move on to the next thing you're going to do, and it's just a little back talk, so it's no big deal.
Right.
But in the long term, it'll be a lot easier if we handle those situations and not let them grow.
Nip it early, because if you don't nip it early, then that child will grow up, and there will be much more bold defiance that wouldn't have been a problem probably had that been fixed early on in the formative years.
And then we have the Proverbs on corporal punishment, like Proverbs 13:24, 22:15, 23:13 and 14, and 29:15, showing that God is on the pro-spanking side of the debate about how we should punish our children. And, of course, the spanking is not child abuse, but is loving discipline carried out by faithful parents who are doing it out of love and not out of anger, doing it out of care and not out of meanness or spite toward their children, because they want their children to learn. Spanking is an educational enterprise and not a wrathful thing. And so as we do that consistently and lovingly, we know that God will help us to rear our children as we try to parent in God's way. Well, we could go on with that, but for sake of time, we only have about 13 minutes left, and we still haven't talked about the promise. And maybe we should, for sake of time, skip over 2 Kings 22, verses 23 through 25. If you've read the article, Diggers, if you've read the article by Wayne Jackson about that passage, I thought that was very helpful to show that God was not being cruel toward these young men, or this was not some great injustice. Sometimes people treat that passage as though they're all these little kids who are coming out and joking with Elijah about his baldness, and then, Elisha and his baldness, and bears come out and eat them out of the blue, and these poor little children were just murdered by God sending bears, and that's just not the picture that we should really have when we understand that passage. That phrase, young men, is notoriously difficult to translate, but these people are probably living at Bethel, are probably already involved in idol worship, and were deserving of death according to the old law to begin with, beyond just the spitefulness toward Elisha. Anyway, I just wanted to highlight that, because when we talk about honoring those who are older, that's a passage that drives home the significance of it.
Yes, I mean, these really are young men, and it's obvious that they have already chosen the path they want to go on, which is no good. And I think there's something to be said about God in his foreknowledge, seeing the terrible path that someone has already chosen, and knowing that this child or this young man, because he's chosen wickedness, he already knows all the sin that is in that young man's future, and
Sure.
Extinguishing that life after that life has already chosen wickedness.
And God, as the Creator, is uniquely positioned to take life. He's the judge of all the earth who will do right. If God takes a life, then that's his prerogative. It's not our prerogative to take life in a way that God has not authorized. But when God does it, there's no court of appeals into which we could take God, because God
never
has
makes
the
a
right
mistake.
to do it.
Always gets it right.
Right. Then we turn over to the New Testament, to Mark 7, 8 through 13, where Jesus talks about the Pharisees' habit of dishonoring their parents by taking money that ought to be used to support their aged parents, and instead, ostensibly at least, putting it into the temple treasury as a donation to God. So the idea apparently was, if you study the background of this, the use of the word Corban, as we ask the Diggers to do, is that they would say, I would benefit you by this money, but it's a donation to the temple. And so once I vowed to give this as a donation to the temple, then I'm so bound by that vow that even if you're starving, I can't take some of this money and support you with it. And God says to the Pharisees, you have missed obeying the command to honor your father and mother, because this money is really owed to them.
It's a very clever argument. I mean, they're trying to pit one command against another, and They're very clever in how they did it, but they missed the point. They missed the heart of the issue, and we must always look at the heart of what God's commandments are.
Also, Luke 16:14 says of the Pharisees that they were lovers of money. And the first thing, if you're a lover of money, if you're covetous, the first thing you would do is cut off your support for anybody other than yourself. And that would include donations to charitable organizations or to the church or whatever the case may be. So it's been speculated that when the Pharisees were saying Corban, they really were probably just using the money for themselves. And when we look at the character of the Pharisees throughout this text, throughout Matthew especially, we get an impression that they were very selfish. For example, Jesus says in Matthew 23, there at the beginning of the chapter, that you should do what they say, but not as they do. In many cases, that is, they were teaching what the law of Moses said, but doing otherwise. Well, let's think then about what they were saying. If they're teaching the law of Moses, they're teaching tithing, but were they tithing themselves? That is really called into question by Jesus' statement. We don't know all the specifics of what they were doing, but we do know that they were lovers of money.
They probably could have easily helped their parents and given very liberally to the temple, but they probably couldn't have done both while maintaining the lifestyle that they wanted. And so the issue was whether they wanted to really sacrifice to help their parents or not. And they were just unwilling to do that.
That's right. Okay, well, let's think about we have about 7 minutes left. So first, let's think about the gradual independence that a person gains as he grows into adulthood. And then we'll talk about, concomitant with that, the promise that's attached to the command, which is in the Old Testament that the children of Israel would live long in the land. That is, that they would continue to possess the promised land, which is interesting because God regularly in various passages, I noted Exodus 6:8, Exodus 12:25, Exodus 13:5, 33:1, Numbers 13:12, over and over again, God promises the Israelites that if they'll remain faithful to Him, they can keep the promised land. But also, they've got to honor their father and mother. So part of remaining faithful to God and keeping the promised land is honoring father and mother so you can keep the promised land. So they cannot honor God properly and keep the promised land unless they're going to honor their parents also. So we cannot separate those out. You can't say, I'm faithful to God, I don't treat my parents very well. In the same way that you can't say, I'm faithful to God, I just don't treat my spouse very well. Or whatever the case may be, we have got to keep the horizontal relationships godly, not just the vertical relationship with God. So that promise is attached to the command. So we'll get to that in just a minute, but let's notice about growing up and we gain our independence. The passages I put on the study were Genesis 2:24, leaving father and mother, cleaving to the wife, 1 Timothy 5:8, providing for your own, Ephesians 5:22 and 23 about spiritual leadership of the household. All of that would indicate that we're taking a financial independence from our parents. We're taking an emotional independence from our parents. We are assuming the responsibility of spiritual leadership in our own home, whereas in our parents' home, Dad had that responsibility. We're seeing from 1 Peter 1:16 that we've got to be holy like God is holy. It's not just that Mom and Dad have to do that, but now we're adults. We've got to make sure that we remain holy as well. So all of that spells a life of independence from Mom and Dad, which implies lack of obedience. We cannot continue to obey. I can't rule my own household like an elder. You know, to be qualified, he's got to rule his own house well. But I can't rule my own house well if I feel that I'm obligated to do whatever Mama says still. See, I've got to be in charge of my own household. So even though there's not a Bible verse that says, thou shalt be in independence from your parents, still that command to obey can only last for so long when we are making our own households.
Absolutely. You've got to be able to stand on your own 2 feet. And this is This is important. There comes a point where we need to be able to learn to think for ourselves, and we do things not just because our parents did it, but uh, all of these commands to be independent, to leave father and mother, to be the spiritual leaders of our own household, carry with it the implication that we recognize not just the wisdom of our parents, what they taught us through the years, and apply that wisdom to our lives, but also get to a point where our spiritual lives are built on the rock of Jesus Christ and not on our parents. And we're able to even recognize the shortcomings of our parents
Right.
and improve upon them in our own lives.
Right. Well, I remember hearing Wendell Winkler talking about one time how he would go and visit rest homes, nursing homes and retirement homes, and just observe the loneliness that was in the faces of so many people there, and how if you started a conversation with somebody there, they might talk to you for 30 minutes, even if you didn't know them, just because they were so desperate to have somebody to talk to. And that struck me because I never want to let my parents waste away in loneliness, and I want to urge other people to take steps, concrete steps, to make sure that they're following the golden rule with their parents. And that can be very challenging when, as you were saying earlier, as parents lose their ability to do some of the things that you used to be able to do, and you have to take more of that load, and it mirrors the child-parent relationship that existed when we were babies. And so we have to make a lot of sacrifices sometimes in order to make that happen. But how would God view it, given all the passages we've considered today? How would God view it if we treat our parents in such a way that they're basically left alone to rot somewhere and we don't give them much attention? That would be a tragedy and a travesty.
Absolutely. The golden rule, as it relates to this parent-child relationship, requires us to be able to put ourselves in their shoes. And we have to imagine what it's like to be elderly. What would it be like to be an elderly parent? And you have to imagine that before you reach that point. And the golden rule requires us that we be able to do that and then respond to them as we have imagined being in their place.
Finally, before we stop, let's think about children and their desire for independence. The last thing I said in our notes for today was that children can have an unhealthy desire for independence, or I should say a desire for independence that can be abused. I mean, the desire to be independent, as we're talking about, is a natural thing. God put it in us. It's great for us to want to move out eventually and start our own families and so forth. But that desire to be independent, especially in a young person who's still living at home, could be misapplied. And that would indicate he's throwing off the shackles of his parents' rules and his parents' guidance, and doesn't want to be led by his parents who are trying to take him toward God. We think of the prodigal son, for example, as somebody who was saying, I just can't stand to be at home anymore. I've got to go to the faraway country, which didn't just mean pursuing independence in my life, but meant pursuing the opposite of what my father wants for me. And so that's a dangerous abuse. And a child, for example, could not be able to distinguish between clear thinking and rebellion. Or he might mistake the safe haven of his home just because it has rules. He might mistake that for a prison. Just don't want my parents' rules anymore. What comes to your mind when you think about children pursuing independence, which is natural, but pursuing it in a way that God would not authorize?
Well, what comes to my mind is Proverbs 1:8, where you read this command, "Hear, my son, your father's instruction. Forsake not your mother's teaching." And there's other passages that are just like that that teach that principle. I think I think children, by the fact that they're children, they are younger than their parents, and because they are younger, they don't share their parents' experiences, and it is easy to not appreciate or fail to acknowledge the experiences of their parents, and therefore you're not willing to heed their instruction. You cannot consider why they they have this opinion that you do not share. Why is it? Well, you don't share their experiences. They have
Right.
reasons for teaching what they teach.
And just in the same way that we may not always understand why God holds the view that he does about
Right.
something. We may have not had the instruction or experience that would allow us to see it from his point of view. So there's, on the one hand, an unhealthy desire for independence. But then on the other hand, there could be an unhealthy desire for dependence. And by that, I'm referring to when children rebel against their parents, it's very often because they are dependent on some other group for validation or for support or for fun or whatever the case may be. So if the crowd is going in one direction or their peers are going in one direction and it's away from the moorings of their godly parents, then it's liable to sweep them away with it. And the kids might say, the young people might say, well, I want to be independent from my parents. But really what's being sought is not so much independence, but is dependence on a crowd of people who have different ideals. And you're going to do exactly what they would like for you to do or exactly what's cool in their eyes.
Absolutely. We need to make sure that we are finding validation and self-worth, not only just in our parents and what they are instructed by God to give us, but we need to start pivoting to finding who we are, not based on peer pressure, but based on the fact that we're made in God's image and that our worth, our true worth, is based upon whether or not we are obedient to his will and we are humbly trying to do his will.
Social networking can affect our opinion of ourselves to where we think, well, if somebody doesn't like what I shared, or if somebody doesn't retweet what I've said, or if somebody doesn't, I don't know all the right phraseology about those things, but if somebody doesn't promote me, if somebody doesn't show publicly online appreciation for me, then somehow that affects my worth. But parents have a way of instilling proper biblical self-estimation, that Jesus died for me. Like you said, I'm made in God's image. That's where my value as a human being has come from. And so I'd be happy for other people to think well of me, but ultimately that doesn't affect whether I'm valuable.
Absolutely.
I asked for 2 New Testament passages that imply that a person ought to reject the ungodly advice of peers. I don't know which passages come to your mind, but maybe Romans 12:2 about not being conformed to this world. That would imply refusing advice of ungodly peers. Maybe 1 John 2:15 and 16 about not loving the world or the things that are in the world. I'm thinking of Old Testament passages too, like Exodus 23:2 about not following a multitude to do evil. So I don't know what comes to your mind about passages that would help us, like 1 Corinthians 15:33, that evil companionships corrupt good morals. So if I've got Christian parents, and again, not everybody does, but if I've got Christian parents, honorable parents, and they're giving me advice, maybe I'm even old enough to where I don't have to obey a command that they give. But if my godly parents are saying, as a spiritual counsel to you, we would like for you to consider such and such, then all things being equal, shouldn't I consider it? Shouldn't I really take it seriously or put a lot of weight on it, so that even if I wind up saying, no, I'm going to do something different from what my parents said, they deserve the courtesy, they deserve the respect of giving that some careful thought?
Yes. Yes, they deserve the weight, and you shouldn't. You owe it to your parents to not just disregard their wishes. To really ponder it, to give the thought to it that it deserves before. I mean, it might be bad. Their request might not be what is best for them or best for you, but give it the thought it deserves before you go a different direction.
We're out of time, Ben, but I have really enjoyed our study today about honoring father and mother, and both of us are blessed with Christian parents for whom we're thankful every day and for whom we are appreciative, to whom we're appreciative for their example of godly parenting that we're seeking to follow even today with our children. And some days that feels more intimidating than on other days, I'm sure, because of the challenges we have as parents. But it's also fun, and we're enjoying it very much. Okay. Well, we'll see you all next month as we continue our study of the Ten Commandments, and we appreciate comments, questions, anything you would like to contribute to the podcast. Be thinking in the coming weeks as you study the material how you want to contribute to the podcast, because we would like more participation from our diggers in creating the podcast. We know that you're studying the material, but we would like to have some more contribution to our conversation here. So if you would like for us to tackle a particular question or issue, please submit that. You can post it in the Facebook group. You can email it to me or to Ben. My email is calebcolley@gmail.com. Ben is ben@plainsimplefaith.com, and we would love to hear from you at any time. All right, thanks so much for being with us, Ben.
Great to be here. I enjoyed it.
See you next time.